I'm a 26-year-old guy, and a few months ago, I inherited my grandparents' house. It's not a mansion or anything, but it's perfect. A cozy little place with a lot of character. My grandparents had spent decades taking care of it, filling it with antique furniture, vintage knickknacks, and a ton of sentimental items. It's the kind of place that feels like home the moment you step inside. My family, for the most part, is pretty close. We have our moments, though, especially when it comes to my Aunt Linda. She's 45 and has 3 kids, ages 7, 9, and 12. Linda's always been the type to think the world revolves around her. She means well sometimes, but her parenting style is basically letting her kids do whatever they want. It's not uncommon for family gatherings to turn into chaos because her kids are climbing furniture, spilling drinks, or breaking something. Most of the time, she just laughs it off and says, they're just being kids. Meanwhile, everyone else is left cleaning up the mess. A couple of weeks ago, Linda called me out of the blue. She said her house was getting some renovations done, and she needed a place to stay for the weekend with her kids. I hesitated because, honestly, the idea of those kids running loose in my grandparents' house made my stomach turn. But Linda was insistent. She promised the kids would be supervised, and it would just be for 2 nights. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Before they arrived, I made sure to set some ground rules. I told Linda outright that certain rooms were off limits, like the attic and my grandparents' old study. I also made it clear that the kids weren't to touch anything fragile or valuable. Linda waved it off like it was no big deal and assured me they'd be on their best behavior. When they showed up on Friday evening, it was like a tornado hit my front door. The kids burst inside, shouting and running in different directions before Linda even got her bags out of the car. I tried to keep calm and reminded everyone about the rules. Linda nodded absent-mindedly, already scrolling through her phone. Within the first hour, I caught the youngest kid jumping on my couch while the middle one was trying to climb a bookshelf. I told them to stop, but Linda just chuckled and said, "Oh, don't mind them. They're just excited." I had a bad feeling, but I didn't want to start a fight, so I let it go. Later that night, while I was in the kitchen, I heard a loud oops from the living room. I rushed in to find juice spilled all over a vintage rug my grandparents had brought back from a trip overseas. I grabbed some towels and started blotting the stain, trying not to let my frustration show. Linda barely looked up from her phone and muttered something about kids being messy. By the time I went to bed, I was exhausted. But the night wasn't over yet. Around midnight, I heard footsteps and whispers coming from upstairs. I followed the noise to find all 3 kids in the attic, surrounded by old photo albums and boxes of keepsakes. The attic was supposed to be locked, but somehow, they had managed to get in. When I asked what they were doing, they shrugged and said they were exploring. Linda's response? They're curious. It's good for them to learn about family history. The next morning, the damage became even more apparent. A vase that had been on the dining room table was in pieces on the floor. There were scratches all over the dining table itself, and several kitchen appliances had been pulled out and left scattered across the counters. I confronted Linda about it, but she just rolled her eyes and said, "It's just stuff. You can replace it." Things hit a breaking point on Saturday afternoon. I had to run to the store to grab a few things, and when I came back, I found the kids in the backyard. They had gotten into my shed, pulled out some tools, and were using them to build something. In the process, they managed to break a section of my fence and shatter a window on the patio door. I was livid. When I demanded that Linda take responsibility, she turned it around on me. She said I should have kid-proofed the house if I didn't want anything broken. She accused me of being too uptight and making her feel unwelcome. Instead of staying for the rest of the weekend, she announced they were leaving early. She packed up her kids, and by the time they drove off, I was left standing in my backyard, surrounded by the mess they had made. Now I'm stuck trying to figure out how to handle this. The house is more than just a building to me. It's a piece of my family's history. Seeing it disrespected like this is infuriating, but I don't know how to make Linda understand that. I've never been the confrontational type, but I don't think I can just let this go. Update 1. The next morning, I went through the house to assess the damage. I had already seen the broken fence and shattered patio window, but as I walked through each room, the full extent of the destruction became clear. The vintage rug in the living room was stained beyond repair. My grandparents' dining table had deep scratches across the surface, and one of the dining chairs was missing a piece of the backrest. In the kitchen, several small appliances had been knocked over, and a cupboard door hung loosely on its hinges. When I made it to the study, I froze. The vintage clock that had sat on the mantel for decades, a clock my grandparents cherished, was lying on the floor, shattered. Its delicate glass face was cracked, and the hands were bent at odd angles. It felt like a punch to the gut. That clock wasn't just an heirloom, it was one of the last tangible connections I had to them. I took photos of everything, documenting the damage from every angle. I texted Linda later that day. I explained what I'd found and asked her to cover the cost of repairs. Her response came almost immediately, a string of laughing emojis followed by, "Kids are kids. What do you expect?" She didn't offer to pay for anything, didn't apologize, just brushed it all off like it was nothing. When I told my parents what had happened, they tried to play peacemakers. They said I should let it go for the sake of family harmony. My dad suggested that things can be replaced and reminded me how Linda was a single mom who was already under a lot of stress. My mom told me I was being too harsh and needed to move past it. Some other relatives chimed in as well, saying I should have known better than to let Linda and her kids stay in the house in the first place. It was clear people were picking sides. I wasn't about to let this slide, though. I called a few repair companies to get estimates for fixing the fence, the patio window, and the dining table. Altogether, it came to just over $3,000. I forwarded the estimates to Linda, hoping it might push her to take responsibility. Instead, she went on the offensive. Within hours, she posted a long rant on Facebook, accusing me of being anti-family and exaggerating the damage to make her look bad. She painted herself as a victim, claiming she and her kids were treated like criminals in my home. I started getting messages from relatives, some siding with Linda, others expressing quiet support for me but saying they didn't want to get involved. Then, out of nowhere, one of my cousins, Linda's niece, reached out. She told me this wasn't the first time Linda had pulled something like this. Apparently, Linda had a history of letting her kids destroy other people's property and then refusing to take responsibility. My cousin even shared a few stories from her own experiences, which made me feel a little less alone in dealing with this. A friend of mine suggested I talk to a lawyer. At first, I thought it was overkill, but the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like the only way to hold Linda accountable. I scheduled a consultation and started pulling together all the evidence I had, photos of the damage, repair estimates, and the texts Linda had sent me. Meanwhile, Linda wasn't done. She sent me another text, dripping with sarcasm. "You've always been too sensitive. Grow up." It felt like she was daring me to take things further, like she thought I wouldn't actually stand up to her. I decided to update Reddit about everything that had happened. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of people weighed in, sharing similar stories and urging me to take legal action. Some recommended small claims court, while others suggested cutting ties with Linda altogether. My parents, worried about how this was escalating, suggested a family meeting to mediate. I didn't want to go, but they convinced me it would be better than letting things drag on. When the day came, it was a disaster from the start. Linda brought her kids, who immediately started running wild, ignoring everyone's attempts to keep them under control. During the discussion, Linda accused me of setting her up to fail by letting her stay in a house that wasn't kid-friendly. She refused to take responsibility for anything and made it clear she wasn't going to pay for the damages. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, my uncle Linda's brother stepped in. He offered to cover part of the costs to end the drama. While I appreciated the gesture, it felt wrong to let him take the fall for Linda's behavior. Still, it was the first time someone in the family had openly acknowledged that Linda was in the wrong. That meeting solidified my decision. Letting Linda off the hook would only reinforce her entitlement. I wasn't going to let her walk away from this without facing some consequences. I told my parents and uncle that I appreciated their efforts to mediate, but I had already decided to pursue legal action. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about standing up for myself and protecting my grandparents' legacy. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments or additional details added to the update. Update 2. After the disaster of the family meeting, I went ahead and filed a small claims court case against Linda. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but after everything that had happened, the damage, the deflection, the social media posts, I knew this was the only way forward. The filing process was straightforward. I submitted the evidence I'd gathered, photos of the broken items, repair estimates, and copies of our text exchanges. The court date was set for 3 weeks later. When Linda found out, she exploded. My phone lit up with messages, each one more hostile than the last. She called me a traitor and said I was tearing the family apart. She even accused me of trying to ruin her life out of spite. Then, in typical Linda fashion, she threatened to cut me out of her life entirely, as if that was supposed to scare me. My parents weren't happy about the legal action either. They called to plead with me, asking if I really wanted to go through with this. My mom kept saying how hard this was for the family and how my grandparents would have hated to see us fighting. My dad tried to convince me to drop the case, saying it wasn't worth the permanent damage it would do to our relationships. I listened, but I didn't change my mind. Over the next few days, I focused on preparing for court. I printed out all the photos, including the shattered clock and the broken fence, and made a timeline of events. I included the repair estimates and highlighted the dismissive texts Linda had sent me. My cousins came through for me too. The one who had reached out earlier helped me gather statements from other family members who had dealt with Linda's entitlement in the past. Their stories painted a clear picture of someone who never took responsibility for her actions. Meanwhile, Reddit was a lifeline. After I updated my post, the response was overwhelming. People shared similar experiences, offered advice, and even linked me to resources about small claims court. Some users sent private messages with tips on presenting my case. The support was like a tidal wave, and it made me feel more confident about standing my ground. Linda wasn't sitting idle, though. She doubled down on her campaign to paint herself as the victim. Her Facebook posts became more frequent, each one more dramatic than the last. She claimed I was trying to bankrupt her and accused me of being heartless. She even implied I was doing this because I hated her kids. It was clear her audience was divided. Some people in the comments supported her, but others started calling her out, asking for the full story. Then the guilt trip started. One evening, I got a package in the mail. Inside were 3 handwritten letters, one from each of Linda's kids. At first, I thought they might be genuine, but as I read them, it became obvious they were coached. The letters apologized for the trouble, but blamed me for making things harder on their mom. It was a low blow, but I refused to engage. As the court date approached, Linda's lawyer reached out with a settlement offer. She offered to pay a small fraction of the repair costs if I agreed to drop the case. It wasn't even close to covering the damages, and I turned it down. This wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about accountability. The day of the trial came quickly. Linda showed up in full dramatic mode, playing the part of a single mom being unfairly targeted. She denied everything, claiming the damage wasn't as bad as I made it out to be, and that I was only suing her out of spite. But her story fell apart the moment I presented my evidence. The photos and repair estimates spoke for themselves, and the judge wasn't impressed by Linda's excuses. Her attempt to shift blame didn't hold up against the timeline I'd meticulously laid out. In the end, the judge ruled in my favor. Linda was ordered to pay the full amount of damages plus court fees. It was a huge relief, but the aftermath was just as messy as I expected. Some family members called to congratulate me, saying it was about time someone stood up to Linda. Others accused me of being heartless and petty. The divide in the family was more obvious than ever. I updated Reddit that evening, sharing the outcome with everyone who had been following the story. The response was incredible. People were thrilled to see justice served and flooded the comments with support. Some even called it a victory for everyone dealing with entitled family members. Linda, predictably, didn't take the ruling well. She blocked me on every platform and started spreading rumors about me to anyone who would listen. I ignored it all. I was done trying to reason with her or repair the relationship. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of closure. I had done everything I could to stand up for myself and protect what my grandparents had left behind. Whatever came next, I was ready to move forward without Linda's drama hanging over me. Update 3. After the court ruling, Linda was ordered to pay the full damages and court fees, but things didn't exactly move forward smoothly. Weeks passed, and there was no sign of payment. Linda claimed financial hardship, which didn't surprise me at all. She was consistent in one thing: avoiding responsibility. I debated my options, including garnishing her wages, but I didn't want to escalate things too quickly. For now, I decided to wait and see if she'd comply on her own. The delay didn't go unnoticed by the family. Tensions flared as the divide became more apparent. Some family members openly supported me, saying Linda needed to be held accountable for her actions. Others accused me of overreacting and ruining the family dynamic. At one point, my mom called to say she wished I'd just drop everything and move on. My dad echoed similar sentiments, trying to convince me it wasn't worth the continued drama. In the middle of all this, my uncle, Linda's brother, stepped in again. He contacted her and tried to reason with her, urging her to pay up and avoid further embarrassment. I wasn't in the loop on exactly how that conversation went, but shortly after, Linda sent me a partial payment. It wasn't even half of what she owed, but it was enough to show she was at least acknowledging the ruling, barely. Then, out of nowhere, I got a message from a distant cousin. They told me Linda had just bought a brand new TV and booked a vacation for her and the kids. This was the same person who was pleading financial hardship to avoid paying what she owed. I was floored but not surprised. I saved the screenshots my cousin sent, knowing they might come in handy later. Meanwhile, Linda wasn't backing down on her social media antics. She kept posting vague statuses about betrayal and being let down by family. The posts didn't mention me by name, but everyone knew who they were about. A few mutual friends sent me screenshots, shaking their heads at the ridiculousness of it all. It was clear she was playing the victim card for all it was worth. Through all this, my cousins and friends were a solid support system. One weekend, a few of them organized a small get-together to cheer me up. We spent the evening reminiscing about family events, and they reminded me I wasn't alone in this mess. It was exactly what I needed at the time, especially when I was starting to feel the weight of the situation. At home, I found myself spending more time restoring some of my grandparents' damaged items. Fixing the heirloom clock took weeks, but when I finally hung it back on the wall, it felt like a small victory. As I worked, I thought about my grandparents and the values they instilled in our family. It was hard not to feel conflicted, wondering how they'd feel about the ongoing drama. One morning, I got a letter in the mail. It was from Linda's oldest child, the 12-year-old. The letter was surprisingly heartfelt and honest. They apologized for their behavior during the visit and said they now understood how much trouble it had caused. It felt genuine, not like the coach letters Linda had sent before. I appreciated the gesture and decided to hold on to it as a reminder that not everyone in this situation was hopeless. The next family gathering was awkward, to say the least. Linda avoided me entirely, but her kids seemed genuinely apologetic. They stayed out of trouble and even helped clear the table after dinner. It was a stark contrast to the chaos they had caused at my house. Update 4. With the wage garnishment process underway, life finally started to quiet down. While Linda had yet to fully comply with the court ruling, the steady stream of small payments trickling in through the garnishment gave me some closure. Still, the emotional toll of everything lingered. The family drama, the constant tension at gatherings, and the awkward conversations with relatives left their mark. To deal with it all, I decided to start therapy. I hadn't realized how much stress I was carrying until I began talking to a professional. They helped me sort through the guilt from family backlash and the frustration of dealing with Linda's entitled behavior. Slowly, I learned to let go of the things I couldn't control. Then something unexpected happened. Linda's oldest child, the 12-year-old who had sent me the heartfelt letter, reached out again. This time, they offered to help repair some of the damage to my house, specifically the fence. I was surprised but appreciated the gesture. It felt genuine, so I agreed. On a sunny Saturday, the two of us worked side by side, hammering nails and replacing broken planks. It wasn't perfect, but by the end of the day, the fence was back in one piece. The moment felt like a small step forward. Seeing the effort from someone so young gave me a glimmer of hope that maybe not everything in this situation was irreparable. Of course, Linda caught wind of the fence repair and wasn't happy about it. She accused me of manipulating her kids against her and started spinning more stories about how I was turning the family against her. I didn't bother responding. By this point, I had decided to enforce strict boundaries. I let Linda know she was no longer welcome in my home unless she fully paid the damages. It wasn't about pettiness, it was about protecting myself and the legacy my grandparents left behind. The next family gathering brought another round of drama. Linda, clearly still fuming, tried to publicly shame me during dinner. She went on about how I had treated her unfairly and made her feel like an outcast. But this time, she didn't get the support she was expecting. Other family members stepped in, pointing out her long history of entitled behavior. One of my uncles even reminded her about past incidents where she had refused to take responsibility for similar situations. For once, I wasn't the one defending myself, others were doing it for me. Around this time, I started dating someone new. They were kind, supportive, and helped me see things from a healthier perspective. They encouraged me to focus on the relationships that mattered and let go of the toxic ones. With their help, I began to see the value in cutting Linda out of my life entirely if she continued to bring nothing but negativity. Meanwhile, Linda's behavior started catching up with her. People who had previously defended her began to see through her manipulative tactics. She faced more backlash from family and friends who were tired of her playing the victim. It wasn't long before her social circle started shrinking. The ripple effect from my situation seemed to inspire some changes in the family dynamic. Relatives who had sided with Linda initially began reaching out to me, apologizing for their reactions and acknowledging her behavior. A few even offered to help repair the strained relationships. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but it felt like progress. Months later, I received a text from Linda. It was short and lacked any real accountability. She said she was ready to move on and hoped we could put everything behind us. It wasn't the apology I had hoped for, but by then I realized I didn't need her acknowledgement to find closure. I thanked her for finally completing the payments, which she had only done after I threatened further legal action, and left it at that. Back at home, I focused on restoring the damaged heirlooms. The vintage clock my grandparents had cherished was finally fully repaired and looked as good as new. It felt like a symbolic moment, bringing the house and their legacy back to life. I hung the clock on the wall and took a step back, feeling a renewed connection to the home and its history. The family dynamic shifted noticeably after everything that had happened. More people began standing up to Linda, refusing to tolerate her behavior. It was clear that her actions had consequences far beyond just my situation. In a way, confronting her had started a domino effect, inspiring others to push back against her entitlement. For my part, I decided to close this chapter for good. I posted a final update on Reddit, thanking everyone for their support throughout the ordeal. The community had been an incredible source of advice, encouragement, and shared experiences. I told them how much I'd learned about setting boundaries and prioritizing my peace and well-being over toxic relationships. As I moved forward, I knew one thing for sure. My grandparents' house wasn't just a place. It was a reminder of the strength and values they had instilled in me. It was my home, my sanctuary, and I was determined to protect it, no matter what. Update 5. After months of dealing with Linda's chaos, I finally decided to cut all ties. The no-contact decision wasn't something I broadcasted. I simply stopped engaging with her entirely. No more texts, no social media interactions, no acknowledging her attempts to stir up drama. Life without her constant negativity felt lighter. Almost like a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had been lifted. Without Linda's interference, I started focusing on the relationships that truly mattered. My cousins and I grew closer, especially the ones who had been supportive throughout the ordeal. We started meeting up more often, talking about everything from family memories to future plans. These connections felt stronger now, forged in the fire of shared frustration and mutual support. Linda, of course, didn't disappear entirely. She kept up her vague, passive-aggressive posts on Facebook, talking about being betrayed by people she thought she could trust. I heard about it through the grapevine, but I didn't engage. I had learned the hard way that responding only gave her more fuel. Ignoring her was the best choice, and it worked. Over time, her posts became less frequent, and I stopped hearing about them altogether. With the payments finally complete, I turned my attention to restoring the house. The repairs were already done, but I wanted to bring the place back to its former charm. I replaced old wallpaper, repainted the trim, and even refinished some of the furniture. Each project made the house feel more like mine, while still honoring my grandparents' memory. I also framed a restored photo of them and hung it in the living room, a quiet but powerful symbol of closure and strength. Therapy was a huge part of this chapter too. It helped me see how much the incident had pushed me to grow. Setting boundaries, even when it meant conflict, wasn't something I was used to. But now, I could see how necessary it was, not just with Linda, but in all areas of my life. This newfound confidence started showing up elsewhere. I began advocating for myself more at work, taking on leadership roles I'd shied away from before. Even in my personal life, I felt more secure in standing up for what I believed in. I also found ways to channel my experience into helping others. Through a local community group, I got involved in projects aimed at supporting people dealing with family conflicts and toxic relationships. Sharing my story, without naming names, helped others see they weren't alone. It felt good to take something so stressful and turn it into something positive. The house became a peaceful haven again, and I decided to host a family gathering without Linda. It was the first time I'd opened my doors to the extended family since the ordeal began. Everyone who came respected the space, and we created new, positive memories together. It felt like a fresh start, a reminder that family could still be a source of joy when the right people were involved. Meanwhile, Linda's behavior started catching up with her. Her pattern of entitlement and deflection alienated more and more family members. Relatives who had once defended her began distancing themselves, tired of her constant drama. By the end of it, Linda was isolated, with fewer allies than ever before. It wasn't something I took pleasure in, it just felt like the natural consequence of her actions. Linda's oldest child, however, stayed in touch. they continued to grow into a responsible teenager, actively breaking away from the cycle of entitlement. We kept things casual, texts now and then, occasional visits, but it was clear they wanted to maintain a connection. Seeing that shift gave me hope that the next generation could break free from the toxic patterns that had plagued our family for years. As I reflected on everything, I realized how much this ordeal had taught me. Standing up for myself hadn't been easy, but it was necessary. It showed me the importance of protecting my peace, even when it meant tough decisions. The lessons weren't just about Linda, they were about life, relationships, and the boundaries that keep both healthy. Reddit played a big role in this journey too. After posting my final update, I was flooded with messages from people sharing their own stories. Many thanked me for showing them it was okay to confront toxic family members. Some even said my story gave them the courage to set boundaries they'd been avoiding for years. Knowing I had helped others made everything feel worthwhile. Now, I'm ready to move forward. I've started planning trips I'd put off for too long, diving into hobbies I'd neglected, and dreaming about the future without Linda's drama weighing me down. Life feels lighter, freer, and full of possibilities. To